Life cycle costing, not life cycle assessment, which is different because we're not focusing here on the environmental side, we're just focusing on the costing side. So because the cost for building is pretty much a bit like an iceberg. The capital cost is just the peak of the building, and the operation cost is what's underneath in the water hidden. But most people, unfortunately, when they design a building, they only focus on the capital cost, but don't see how much the building is going to cost over its entire life cycle. So I grouped my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about life cycle costing, what it is, and about my previous work with Harvard and Stanford and some other departments with the Energy Department of the United States. And in my second part, I'm going to talk about my research. First, you have to understand that every item has an economic life cycle. Usually it starts when you purchase the item. Maybe one time in your life you come to the point where you have 150Ks and you can purchase a brand new BMW i8. Then soon you will realize that's not the only cost you have to come up with, because over its life cycle it will cost you in maintenance and fuel, and after a couple of years you probably need to replace some tires or brakes, and then in the end of its life cycle you may even get some money back, but usually not a lot. So what is life cycle cost analysis now? Well, it's a decision-making tool to evaluate the economic performance of a building. That basically means you take into account how much the building costs over 30 years, 40 years, or even 50 years. And usually you compare different options, but I'll get to that later. You could also do that for your car and do life cycle costing for your BMW, but maybe you find out that 3 Toyotas will be cheaper than 1 BMW. Anyways, for buildings it's a bit more complex because buildings have different mechanical systems. You can improve the envelope and so on and so on. Like on a study here on UBC campus, we're looking into life cycle cost for the new pharmaceutical sciences building. We actually found out that the initial capital cost is less than 50%, and energy accounts for about 7%, and the rest is MRN, which is maintenance, repair, and management costs for the building. Net present value, I'll talk about it in my next slide, what that means. Because, everything gets more and more expensive, unfortunately. So $100 today is not $100 tomorrow. That's why you take your money to the bank, and hopefully you have a good savings account with an interest rate. Probably not 10%, but I hope you get at least something. 10% would mean that if you take $100 now to your bank, put in your account, in 1 year, you have $110 for doing nothing. Well, you won't get 10%, unfortunately. Well, now discounting does exactly the opposite. Now I'm asking, well, $100 today, how much would that have been like last year? So that 10% discount rate, that would be $90. Discounting is important when we talk about future costs. On the upper graphic, you can see that the curve just slowly increases. This is the inflated cost per square foot of the building. So that takes in consideration the energy cost, water cost, maintenance cost, repair cost, security cost, like everything that needs to be paid to operate a building. So the problem is you have to inflate all these costs separately because energy follows like a different inflation. It's called actually an escalation rate, because you probably know fuel costs never go up at 3% or 2% constantly every single year. It's sometimes 6% and it drops down to 2%. So it's a bit more complicated. So you can see that the cost per square foot in the year 2063 is not the same as 2015, of course, because prices are inflated. But when we talk about life cycle costing, we want to compare different options. So I calculate the cost for building over 50 years. But I want to know how much money is that now, not in 50 years. Because if I say, well, this building will cost you $500 million in the year 2063, you're like, well, how much money is that now? So you just count it back, and then you get the actual cost. That's what the graphic below shows. It's actually got these peaks that tell you when you have to invest money in replacing parts. That first one for your car, for example, would be your tires, the second one a brake, and the third huge peak is probably when your engine breaks down. For building, it's similar. You have to replace some parts in the mechanical system or maybe the roof after 50 years. So the lifecycle costing is usually being used to compare different options. As I mentioned before, you have a basic design for building for a budget that's given, and then you say, well, what if I improve the mechanical system? What if I improve the glazing or the envelope of the building? Well, you usually expect that you have some energy savings through it, right? Because your initial capital cost is higher, but you expect to get the money back. And that's what lifecycle costing does. So you actually calculate, well, if I improve my envelope, how much energy am I going to use with the option 1 package or the option 2 package? And then usually, or in some cases, you end up being cheaper with a better option that might be more expensive at its initial cost, but over its life cycle, it's cheaper. You can use like simple LCC calculators, like Harvard designed this one here, which is actually just an Excel spreadsheet with some tricky functions, but it hasn't got any data collected. And that brings me to the point like where it got when I talked to some Harvard and Stanford guys, because the issue about lifestyle costing is you need data to do that. And the better your data is, the more accurate will be your lifestyle cost will be. So even the Department of Energy in the United States, they created their own cost calculator, and they were saying, well, it's actually really important that we use it for every new building, because we're most likely to miss out options if we don't use it. And in the end, you even have like the better building, right? Because you have a higher quality, maybe better glazing, or whatever you invest in the building. The problem about lifestyle costing is that it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, and second, the lack of data availability. Where we're lucky to be on campus, everything is collected. We have a huge selection of electricity data and energy data and for water, for pretty much everything. But for my master thesis, you see like there's all these different categories of costs. I cannot look into all of them. So we're just looking into the energy costs and actually just into the electricity costs, because that's already a lot, as you will see now. So we're looking into 52 buildings here in the core campus. And as you can see here on this graphic, that all buildings use like different amounts of electricity. Well, you could say like, of course, some buildings are bigger, some buildings are smaller. That's what we're trying to investigate here and say like, how is that correlated like with the size of the building? It's quite accurate actually. We're like at a R-square value of 80% already here. So we can tell, well, obviously bigger buildings use more electricity than smaller buildings. But more interestingly is actually to look what's the building being used for. Because like every building or most buildings here in campus are like a combination of classroom spaces, lab spaces, office spaces, and there's this huge chunk of other spaces which is like, you know, stairwells and atriums and Mac rooms, toilets, and what every building's got. So we looked into that for all different buildings in campus, and then we categorize them and say, okay, the building that has a huge percentage of lab space is called a lab building. A building that has a huge amount of classroom space is called a classroom building, and so on. And that's what we were looking into the annual electricity consumption actually here and see what is the variation. So I took the average of all classroom buildings, what we call them classroom buildings, and all lab buildings and all office buildings. And we can see like the fluctuation, which is not a big surprise because in January we have a high heating load and you know, it's dark outside, so you use a lot of light, and then it drops in February during spring break, goes up in March again, and in summer. It's interesting in summer to see that for the lab building, the electricity kind of kicks in because of the additional cooling load. So it's not a big surprise. And then we wanted to just investigate that further to see like how does that look on a weekly scale. So just the week before spring break and the week after, because we were expecting that not too many students are on campus during spring break. Everybody's supposed to leave. And so don't get too confused about the low Monday here in the week before spring break. That's just because it's family day. And nobody's supposed to be on campus anyways doing that. And so it's also not a big surprise because we can tell that the classrooms have a huge drop whenever there is a reading break or not so many students are on campus. Of course, classrooms are not used during that time, while offices, well, there's so many grad students here who still have to work apparently during reading breaks, and for labs it's kind of similar. So there's not a huge difference, as you can see here in the graphics. Well, looking even further in detail and see like how does that look on a regular day. This is just a Friday, I think I chose because everybody likes Fridays. You can see that also for classrooms, it's the electricity consumption kicks in later than for labs. So labs have to pre-cool the area before actually people show up. So it's around like 5 a.m. in the morning. And for classrooms and offices, it's more around like 7, 6-ish when most people come. The goal, or what we're trying to do with the analysis, is to create like an equation which allows us to predict the future electricity consumption of new buildings on campus and even old buildings. So we're trying to find like, okay, so if a building is built with 2,000 square meters classroom and 3,000 square meters lab space and so on and so on and so on, how much electricity will this building use? According to all our buildings we have information from, right? Well, that's also the 3 dots just indicate that there might be some other factors we have to look into. For example, the age of a building. When we analyze data, we have buildings here on campus, some of them are almost 100 years old, and others are brand new. Of course, there will be a difference in the energy consumption. And then the number of floors, because elevators use up to 5% of electricity of a building. And so yeah, the Buchanan Tower, for example, has got like 12 floors or so, and others have like 2 floors. So that might also influence the electricity consumption. Very important step is that we look into occupancy, because some buildings are like very well occupied the way they're supposed to be, and others aren't. Like the Liu Institute, for example, there's just a couple of offices, but every time I go there, it seems to be that. And especially like looking into the occupancy more detailed will allow us to say like, well, what drives the electricity? Where is it being used? Is it like the mechanical system? Or, like how much are occupants using? Like what's the portion of it? And what is it for classroom buildings? What is it for lab buildings? And what is it for office buildings? And finally, you come to my results, or where I want to go personally with this is, well, I want to start creating the lifestyle cost base for UBC, because lifestyle costing has been used here on campus already, but it seems like everybody's just doing it on the back of the envelope, and like there's no consistency, which is a big problem. That everybody uses different discounts rates or different inflation rates or different costs for water and electricity and everything else. And of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done to do lifestyle costing on campus. We need information about the thermal energy of each building, and we also need all other MRM costs, but it's a good step to start. And on the other side, I also want to look into building electricity benchmarking, because we can say through that like what's the baseline of each building type, and also what is the electricity, how much electricity are we using for this building per occupant. That's already the end of my presentation. Seriously, thanks. Oh, it's just a thing here on campus. Different institutions go for different time spans. Here on campus, we usually go for 50 years. However, that's only 30 years, but it's just a UBC thing. Yeah. Yeah, so usually you orientate the discount rate on the local banks. That's what's been done in the past, and UBC get its special discount rate from some, departments that are here involved in financing. So I would personally not choose a different discount rate to what UBC is using, because they have their experience with it. It's 5.75%, and I guess they do update the discount rate like annually at least.
That's the discount rate for financial
Yeah.
investments. How about for energy, for water?
That is the problem, yeah. That needs to be developed too, because we're using the same inflation rate of 3% for almost everything. We have different escalation rates from BC Hydro for electricity. That's like 6% for the next 2 years, and then it drops down to 2.5%, and then it just continues at like 3% for the next 10 years. But, well, we know that, but we don't know how to inflate management costs and so on. That's also just made up by UBC. Rule of thumb, I guess. Mm. So if we can estimate how much electricity a building will use, you probably won't redesign the classroom area, so we'll keep it in the same ratio. I guess that's what you mean. But we can say well, a lab building obviously uses way more electricity than a classroom building. So if we focus, if you build a lab building, you would focus more on reducing electricity than for a classroom building, because it will affect the life cycle cost way more than for another building, right? So you could compare that, and if somebody promised you, well, a better envelope or whatever will reduce your electricity cost, probably not an envelope, but it's not a good example. But anyways, will reduce your electricity cost by 10%. And then you could calculate, well, for a lab building, it may make sense. 10% down, that's, I don't know, a couple of $1 billion over 30 years, 40 years. But for classroom buildings, you would say, well, no, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? Because the building doesn't use a lot of electricity anyways. So we can predict how much each building will use. And then we can say, what's the difference of, the option A that promises 10% less or whatever. So almost all campus core buildings are a mixed use, but we chose 52 buildings because some buildings have special heat pumps and they run on electricity, so they use a lot more. So you cannot really compare them to anything else, but the buildings we've chosen are kind of comparable to each other. Mm. So yeah, that'd be actually a different model. That's what Harvard does, because each school get its own budget, and the School of Law has a budget for electricity, and and if they use more, they have to pay on top of that. And we saw it last year when we were doing all these water investigations here on campus, and some researchers are just dumping 25 cubics per day of water just to cool their lab equipment, and that would not work at Harvard because they had to pay for the water. And here it's just, it's unlimited, kind of. No problem.